Hello and welcome to CMC. I'm Darren Maloney, a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. Great to see everyone today. Bright, shiny day, glistening off of the river there. We welcome you. CMC welcomes everyone. Today, CMC is pleased to present the annual Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Forum as we present Brewing History on Tap in partnership with the Ohio History Connection and the Columbus Landmarks Foundation. It seems with the new craft brewery opening up on a weekly basis that artesian beer and craft brewing are a new thing in Columbus. The modern craft beer movement began almost 30 years ago in 1988 with the Edwards Company's The Brewery District and the aptly and then newly named Brewery District. While brewing as a business and as part of the cultural fabric of Columbus goes farther back than that, much farther, of course. Let's turn to our panel and explore some of the rich history of beer, and as part of that, our shared past history. Please welcome of the Hoster Brewing family, Jay Hoster. Director of Museum and Library Services at the Ohio History Connection, Megan Wood. Okay, get ready for this. So this is quite a title. Brewmaster and considered to be many the godfather of Columbus craft beer, Scott Francis. And our host, who has a book on craft beer coming out soon, writer and author, Curt Schieber. Curt, the podium's yours.
Thank you. First of all, yes, my name is Curt Schieber. I do have a book coming out. Just to get that shameless plug out of the way, it should be out in July or August, I'm hoping, just in time for the Summer Beer Festival downtown. The big question, I suppose, today on a lot of people's minds here is why beer? Why are we talking about beer? Why are we getting together with a group like this to talk about beer? Gambrinus was the last brewery of the old breweries, closed in 1974, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, no locally owned breweries in Columbus until my friend Scott Francis started the Columbus Brewery. That was in 1989, and that was amidst the brewing explosion that was beginning to happen across the country. In fact, in Columbus, it picked up steam, and there were more and more each year. Between 2011 and 2015, there were more than a dozen breweries in Columbus. 5 of them opened in 2012 alone. By my count, we now have 31 breweries. There are a whole lot more coming. That is actually more breweries than were in town for the 160 years since brewing began in 1814. So it's quite an amazing thing. It's a national trend as well. There were 620 new breweries in 2015. In 2016, U.S. Brewers Association said that there were 4,269 breweries in the country, and that brought the total to more than it had ever been in the United States in the past. So that's why we're talking about beer. There are some similarities and some differences between the old brewers and the new, and hopefully we'll get into some of that today. Let's start with Jay Hoster. Jay, your history goes back the furthest. Your great-great-grandfather started the Hoster Brewing Company in 1836, which was the first of the big German brewers. And you grew up with that in your household. They had closed in 1920 or 21, I believe. Was that history always a part of your life growing up?
Sadly, no. And it's almost impossible to explain this to people, but when my family closed down the brewery, they walked away and they didn't save anything. So, you know, all of the Hoster history items that I have bought mostly on eBay, and it's a category on eBay called pre-pro, which means pre-prohibition, and there's some pretty avid pre-pro collectors out there, and it's like, you know, I go out there and say, hey, I'm sorry, that has my name on it, I'm going to get it, but they make me pay for it. But actually, my great-great-grandfather, Louis, in Germany, Rhineland-Palatinate, he was Ludwig. He actually wasn't going to come to Columbus. He was going to Brown County. I think a lot of times if you had family somewhere in America, that's where you would go. But he was in town on July 4th, 1833, and saw the speeches by the governor, the celebrations, and he thought Columbus is a great place and said, hey, I'm going to come back here. And then he did 3 years later, and he's a German guy, and if you're a German guy, you're making your way in the New World, start a brewery. So, and he did. And as Curt said, it grew and it grew and it grew. By the turn of the century, it had actually expanded. There are pictures of New York City street scenes that have a Hoster billboard, which of course I find incredible and amazing. And I even, among my collectibles, which I bought, fighting off the pre-pro brewery collectors, is a Hoster opener from the Hoster distributor in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. So it went that far afield. But certainly the new brewing interest, which Scott was the great forerunner and pioneer, it's amazing how beer has expanded and flowered and flourished.
I might mention that there's a key collector, I think, in Columbus, perhaps one of the key collectors, Mr. David Foster, who actually resuscitated the Gambrinus name in the mid and late 90s. But before that was a huge collector. Now, you know David, and I know that you bought a lot of stuff from him.
Yes.
Any remarks about his collection?
Dave was a guy, I think long before people really thought about brewery collecting. It was something, and he knows everybody, and he talks to everybody, and he was really able to acquire some great stuff. And fortunately, I was able to acquire some things from him, just all kinds of things. One of the things, I know Scott will get into this, but when I did a history of brewery for back in 1976, a magazine article, I had to explain to people there were different types of beer. But this was a new in 1970 because the Hosters put out a Vienna-style beer, a Munich-style beer, a porter, an ale, put out different beers because in 1976 beer was just beer. You had the different brand names. But, you could soak the labels off, and they all basically tasted the same. So now, with the craft brewing explosion, which is really terrific, you don't have to explain that to people anymore. They get that. They understand that.
I think his collection started when he was a kid. He collected beer cans, and it kind of moved on from there. I might mention he's an antique dealer today, so it kind of makes sense. Megan, among the things lost, he's talking about the memorabilia that was lost from his family's collection. There obviously is a whole lot of Columbus architecture that was established during that German era. In the 19th century. A lot of that has disappeared. I know that during the 70s and 80s there was a lot of fights over individual buildings by the Landmarks Foundation and others to save them. Just heard a month or so ago that Wasserstrom is moving out of the old Hoster Brewery building, which is the last and greatest of all those brewery buildings. There have been some fights over the years. Have we done well, and have you heard anything about what will become of the Hoster building?
No news on the Hoster building that I know of anyway, but compared to maybe some have fared better or worse in Columbus being able to maintain the historic character of the brewery district. We have our State Historic Preservation Office, who were obviously interested in maintaining character, but also allowing for growth, that time does march on and we have new uses for old spaces. But I think that visitors who come here, or people like me who came to Columbus as an adult, are able to see that rich history in the names, and obviously German Village is as a residential and business example, but are able to see some of that rich history. But I think if you look at the historic maps, the plat maps, the photos, you do see how much is gone. But I think that there's a lot of pride in what we have now, and I certainly feel that there's a lot of awareness around maintaining as much as we can. Because of the re-engagement in craft brewery and interest in beer. And I think that people living in downtown and people living in Columbus want to live in a place that has character, and that's what the brewery district affords us here.
What does the collection look like at the Ohio History Connection? I noticed you brought some things back
Yeah,
there.
two of our curators, Eric Feingold and Lisa Wood, who you probably met in the back, and I encourage you to talk with some more, brought some pieces from our collection, including some Hoster pieces, some things from the August Wagner Brewery, and also some things from the Prohibition movement, which is a big part of the story here in Columbus, as it is in the whole country. I think that's one of the interesting things in Columbus, is that in Ohio that we typify, the American story, and we were literally the center of the Prohibition movement. So you'll see some items back there. And, we try to take things into the collection that have, a story. So it may not be the best things that collectors want for specific reasons, but have the best stories. So there's a sampling of some of our items, even I like the Bad Frog beer bottle is back there, was banned in Ohio because the frog seems to be flipping the bird. So, and we're always trying to enhance our collection to better tell the story. And, we met Jay a few months ago because we had done a story on WOSU. And so we also then are meeting individuals whose stories enhance our collection.
So unlike Jay, you didn't have to buy your stuff on eBay for the connection.
No, a lot of things come to us by donation, but sometimes we're alerted to auction items.
Well, I might add to that conversation about Westerville being one of the centers of pre-Prohibition. The Anti-Saloon League had its printing wing based there, and apparently astronomical amounts of mail went out of there their post office every day.
Right.
It's interesting and ironic that Scott Francis's new brewery, which is about 2 blocks away from one of the saloons that was blown up, that the brewery is called Temperance Row. And so that leads me to my question for Scott, which is, when you started Columbus Brewery in 1989, were you, it was the 3rd time that name had been used for breweries in Columbus. Were you aware of the brewing history in Columbus at that point? And how do you see what you do with your, admittedly, somewhat traditional compared to a lot of the craft beers? How do you see what you do in relationship to that history and then craft brewing today?
When I got interested in making beer, I started a homebrew store in Clintonville called the Winemaker Shop in the mid-'70s, 74. And so I was selling malt and hops, and so I started making beer at home, and it was okay. But as time went by, the quality of ingredients became better, the malt, the yeast, the hops. And so I started to think, well, maybe something could happen with this. At the same time, the guy that I was buying hops from in Oregon, in the bales of hops, he would stuff some bottles of craft beers that were being made out there that we couldn't get here. And so I'd get to taste, some stuff that was just fantastic, and Pyramid, and a lot of the early guys, Sierra Nevada. And at the same time, we started getting imports here. And, back when I was a kid, beer, you would drive like all the way down to, I lived in Reynoldsburg, you'd drive down to Schmidt's because they had Michelob Dark, and that was exotic. I didn't know that there was anything in the world better than Michelob Dark. And I don't know that there is. But there are different beers. And so kind of at the same time that I was starting to make some beers that I thought were okay, you were also starting to be able to get beers both made in this country and also European. I just thought that traditional styles was the way that you make beer. And so I'm kind of, a dinosaur in that respect. Bass ale, for example, is their trademark is a red triangle, and it's the oldest registered trademark in England. So the styles of beer that I prefer, British style pale ale, Scottish ale, stouts, porters. I named my one son Porter. So that's the style of beer that just always has interested me. So then in the mid 80s, like let's say it was maybe 85, I started thinking about it a little bit more seriously, and my wife Nina, we formed a corporation called the Columbus Brewing Company. It was just on paper, but I knew then that that's what I want to do. And you had to be obsessed then. I mean, it's a lot easier now to get into the business, but back then, there were no breweries. I mean, Great Lakes wasn't open. It was kind of like trying to do something that had never been done. So we started this corporation, and eventually I got a hold of the developers. A mutual friend of mine, Harley Schottenstein, told me to call the Edwards because he had heard that they were going to do this renovation in the brewery district. So I got a hold of Jeff Edwards, and we started on the process of talking about a brewery. He, at the time, didn't think it was a good idea, but after he had traveled around Boston and New York and saw some of these things, he came back and he said, "Hey, let's do this." So we got together, and one of the first meetings that we had at the attorneys, they had already formed the corporation that was going to be the brewing company, and it was called District Brewing Company because it was the brewery district, and it just made all the sense in the world to them because it was their baby, and it made no sense to me, and I told them so. I said, "Look, that's a terrible name," and so I said, I happen to own the rights to Columbus Brewing Company, and so Nine and I traded 2 shares of stock for the name. So that's how the name Columbus Brewing came around, because otherwise it would have been called the District Brewing Company. They wouldn't have sold any beer, and they wouldn't be in business. Or at least that's what I think. So that's how that stuff kind of started, and it was tough back then because you couldn't. People were obsessed with American beer. Light beer was really big, and it was really hard. One of the guys that became an owner at Barley's, I went to Barley's after I was at Columbus Brewing, and he was an owner of Max Cafe and Barley's, and I couldn't give him a keg of the beer to put on tap free. So these guys, I had said this to Kyle, but the bar managers, they're not necessarily real bright. They're good at what they do, but they don't have much imagination, I'll say. So it was real hard back then. It was, Great Lakes had opened up. I was the second brewery in Ohio, and so it was, people just didn't think that, one guy said, why would somebody want to drink a beer made in Columbus when they can buy a beer made in England? And it was a tough challenge. Nowadays, it's a lot easier you just got to have a brewery and a decent beer, and you can get your foot in the door. Thanks.
You're talking about the taste of beer. It makes me think of being young. My dad would give us taste of beer, so we would not want to drink it, and I'd be like, whoa. And then my son, I tried the same thing, but beer's so much better now. He was like, this is good. So it's a big change.
Yeah.
My son used to get a little finger of the foam when he was little, and he's a bartender today, so, go figure.
One of the things terrorized my homebrew store when he came in, too.
Yeah, he would do that. One of the issues that I deal with in my book, and the working title for this thing is Columbus Beer, Recent Brewing and Deep Roots. And the attempt there is to kind of work with the issues surrounding craft brewing and historical brewing. And as I point out in the book, there's there's a romantic notion that craft brewing is simply a rebirth of all these wonderful neighborhood breweries that were all over the country, and family run, family owned, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I discovered pretty quickly was that is not necessarily always the case. So my question to Jay is, one of the things that I talked about with Jim Allison, who runs the Columbus Brew Tours, is that did those old German guys, did they want to be Anheuser-Busch? And my theory is that, in fact, they would have and would have wanted to be Anheuser-Busch had they had the technology, the transportation, all the kinds of things that Anheuser-Busch eventually, and the marketing, of course, which is the most important part these days. So is there an essential difference other than the fact that they were small-ish and that they were neighborhood breweries? Is there really a difference?
Well, certainly in the case of my great-great-grandfather and also his son, they expanded as much as they possibly could. So there were a couple of major technology improvements. One is when Louis Pasteur introduced pasteurization, then you could transport beer. And the other thing was ice machines. And at the current site of the Hoster Brewery, if you're wandering around, there's an older building that has a tripartite design on the facade. You'll see it when you're walking around. And it actually has engraved in stone above the door ice machines. So once you were able to get machines that could refrigerate the product, then at that point you could go to town, and among the displays that Eric has brought from the Ohio History Connection is a picture of a Hoster refrigerated train car. So it was originally a kind of two-way street. Anheuser-Busch and Pabst were definitely coming into this market, but Hoster and the other people here, they were also expanding outward. So I just thought as long as we're talking about Westerville, I actually have a family story, not on my dad's side of the family, the brewing side, but on my mom's side of the family. My uncle, during the 1950s and 60s, he was doing trade shows for the State Department. And he was doing a show, and there's that famous debate, the kitchen debate with Nixon and Khrushchev. So this is not from that particular trade show, but my uncle was doing a trade show like that in the Soviet Union. And this guy wanders up to him and strikes up a conversation, which is pretty daring for a average Soviet guy to do that. And the first thing this guy asked is, "Tell me, have you ever heard of a place called Westerville?" And, my uncle is saying, I was like, well, yeah, I grew up in Central Ohio. It's Central Ohio community. He's trying to think, why would a Soviet citizen, the one place in America he's going to ask about is Westerville, Ohio? And it turns out he used to live in Latvia, and he was the Latvian representative for the Anti-Saloon League, and he got a ton of mail from Westerville, Ohio.
His American issue.
That's what he was interested in.
That's a beautiful story, Jay. Thank you. Let's get one last wrinkle on that from Scott, and then we're going to open it up for questions here today. Scott, just to elucidate here, the differences perhaps between the traditional and the craft beer of today. I was talking to Eric Bean, and he felt like you to some degree, that he's kind of a bridge in between the rebirth along traditional lines and now the crazy craft brewing. The Germans would not have even thought about being that creative with brewing. So are we talking about a whole different animal here, or is there some common ground that craft brewing and the old brewing history has?
Well, when you're speaking of German, they're pretty strict on what they're allowed to put in the beer. There's a law, the Reinheitsgebot, that goes back to 16.
15, 16.
Yeah, And it states, right, and it states that you can only put in barley and water and hops. With the exception of if you're making a wheat beer, you can put in wheat. So they're pretty strict, and that's still in effect today as far as beers that are sold in Germany. So the Germans they're pretty strict as far as what their beers can be like. The British are the same way. Their beers tend to just be barley and water and hops. But, when you go to places, Belgium, and, there's some styles of beer that are pretty unusual, and different yeasts, different flavors. Some of the beers are flavored. And so it's not brand new that there's unusual beers, but I think in our country, we're taking it, to another place. I think, right now, you can't argue with it because everybody's selling as much beer as they can make. So you got to say, well, they're doing something right. But I find it a little bit, I'm glad I'm not positioned in that world where I have to do that, because I wouldn't be good at it. To me, a sour beer is beer that's spoiled. I won't drink it. It's like the newest up-and-coming style that a lot of people love, and they're really highly hopped beers. To me, it's like back in the 90s when, you'd go to the place that had the hottest chili or the hottest chicken wings. It's now who's got the hoppiest beers. I don't go there anymore either, to those places. I'm more of a traditionalist. But the hipsters, I find that maybe their attention span is a little shorter, and that's with all due respect. But I think that the guys that are in the brewers will agree with me that you've constantly got to be doing something new to keep people interested in your brewery, and you can't just stick with one style. You've got to be doing new, and so Lord knows where this is going to wind up. But it is interesting, I got to say.
Just to be a devil's advocate, one of the theories that I have about the whole thing is that it has to do with the fooding of America, and that particular subculture, as not even subculture anymore, taking over basically. But and Columbus is particularly a good place for brewing because we have become a city of foodies, I think. And I trace it back to Alice Waters and the restaurant explorations in San Francisco, Alfred Pete doing the same thing with coffee, and I think it's all kind of interrelated. Just one last question for Jay. If Hoster's was still around, Hoster's was always a family business. Until they finished up, they were a family business, and one generation came after another and took over. If Hoster's was still around, would you be a brewer today?
I'm not sure. It just kind of depends, which members of the family were around. And unfortunately, the brewing, this is a German family, so, it's the firstborn, and of course, it's the male heir. And I have a relative, Elise, who was born in 1907. God rest her soul. She was terrific, outspoken, fun, smart, tough. She would have been the ideal person to sustain the Hoster Brewery and to bring it into the current level of generations. But unfortunately, even when the family got into some other businesses, they never paid any attention to Elise because she was a woman, which was a major, major loss. So it's hard to say. I certainly would hope definitely would hope that apart from minor glitch of prohibition, that yes, we would definitely be in the business today.
Just one historical note in response to that. That actually did come to pass with August Wagner's Gambrinus Brewery in the 50s. First in 1945 when August died, his secretary took over and ran the company. And then after that, his daughter Helen actually became the head of Gambrinus Brewing Company for quite a little while. So, and it was historical enough that it made a huge cover story in the Columbus Dispatch at the time. It's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your question, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial remarks. First question, please.
Hi, my name is Drew McCart. I'm with Event Marketing Strategies. We are proudly located inside the Ice Machines building. That's where our offices are located. We absolutely love our office space. We've kept it historically, I think, authentic. In fact, one of the walls in our space happens to be a 1,900-pound, 7-foot grist stone, a round grist stone that has never moved from the building. So we made a wall out of it to keep it, primarily because Bill Schottenstein didn't want to move it. But I have been in every square foot of that 290,000 square foot building, 2/3 of which is empty. We share it with 2 other companies, and I've just found the history amazing. We're right there at the base of the stack when you get off of Front Street. So that's my only editorial comment, but I just wanted to make that known before I ask my question. But first of all, thank you for all 4 of you bringing your historical perspective and your interest. And this may be a best question for Jay, possibly Curt. I don't know, Scott, with your brewing history, but Jay, I'll throw it to you first. Back in early 1900s, I think it's 1904, is when the collaboration started, and I guess it was your great-great-grandfather, L. Hoster, started the Columbus or Hoster Associated Brewing Company,
Right,
which
exactly.
included Bourne, Schley, Hoster, and Columbus Brewing Company.
Yes.
And I was just curious as how that came about.
Well, it was a time that because actually the brewers were under a lot of pressure. There were statewide prohibition movements, and what I can glean from the information is that those 4 brewers, and this was the very end of 1904, it actually went into effect in 1905, decided that it would be in their best interest to go ahead and put their resources together. I don't really know a whole lot about it, but just in terms of the particular space, the particular building you're in, back in the 1970s and 80s, there used to be a tree growing out of the second floor of that building. It was I would go down there, I would walk around. The place was mostly deserted. It was a very healthy tree. It would green up, the leaves would green up in the spring, and they would fall off in the fall. And the next spring, the leaves would come back. So I always was worried about that building with a tree growing out of it. So, I mean, I'm very, very pleased to see that it is where it is today. And thank you for sharing that.
Oh, absolutely. Invite anybody to come down. The other 2 partnering businesses that are our neighbors in the building have maintained the historical perspective of the building as well. And it's absolutely fascinating to see some of the old equipment, especially on the second floor up where the business Shoot Gerdeman is. So, beautiful building. Thank you again.
Sure.
Yeah, I might add to that MKSK also hires Chris Hostetler, who is a 3rd-generation brewing family in Columbus. His grandfather was one of the original brewers for Wagner, and then, or for Hoster, and then went to Wagner. His son, Alex's son, Alex A, became a brewer as well, and in fact came up with the Mark V light beer for Gambrinus. And then Alex O, who was Alex A's son, became a brewer until his retirement a few years ago, and he brewed for some of the majors as well. So it's interesting history down there.
Also, when I started Columbus Brewing, it was on Front Street, across the street from the Ice House. It was a long, narrow building, and in the front was a pub called Gibby's, which they had the tile Hoster logo on the floor, but and then the Columbus Brewing was in the back, and so that's when I was there. That's where the brewery was.
That tile is actually on the 4th or 5th floor in the Hoster building. Reed Wasserstrom gave me a tour of it, and it's kind of in mothballs up there, so it still exists, and hopefully it'll be dug out at some point or other. And do we have more questions from the audience?
I'm Jane Scott. two questions. One is about the history and one is about the future. Can you list the buildings that are still existing from the old breweries? That we haven't really talked about the physical spaces that are still there. And second is more for Scott, I guess, the future of craft beer. Will there be, hate to use this word, pun intended, saturation point with so many craft breweries in a city like ours?
You want to do the?
Well, as far as the historical buildings are concerned, yeah, there's a lot of them that are still there. The Bushy building is actually Schlee's brewery, the last part of Schlee's brewery, the grand brewery that Nicholas Schlee wanted to build. The Worley building, which used to be the site for CD 101, a station that I happen to work for, is now Rock Mill's Tavern, and for a while was the World of Beers. That Worley building with the turrets down there, that was Hoster's horse stable.
Yes.
Let me think about, there are others, though. The winery down there was part of the Bourne complex, was it?
It was part of Schlee.
The part of the Schlee. And Bourne complex was on the other side, that's right, and that's all gone. Trying to think of what else is down there. The bottling plant is where, to the left of Double Happiness, as you're facing those buildings, in other words, just off of Livingston on front. I'm sure there's more.
The Schlee stable is still there.
That's still there. It's turned into an office.
And Nicholas Schlee's home is Germania.
That's right.
But I didn't know if there were others that, the Wasserstrom building was part of the Hoster complex, right?
Which one?
The Wasserstrom buildings were all part of Hoster's complex.
Yeah. Now, they ripped down the front in the early 60s and put that modern part on the front of that. So it was substantially larger than that, and there were buildings actually where Brewer's Gate is now as well. And yeah, I mean, the homes all over the area have brewing history as well.
You know, when the Edwards family, when I got involved with them, they gave me a tour of all those buildings, and it was before anything had been built. And I went into the basement of one of the buildings, the Schlee building, and I wanted to put the brewery there, but they wanted it to be over in the building where we put it. But my friend Jane owned a winery, and I got a hold of her, and I said, you know, you might want to hook up or give these guys a call, and you did.
Do you remember the evening that Jeff and his girlfriend then, Lisa, and you came out to Wyandotte Winery? And I think Jeff tasted everything that we made, and he walked out the door saying, we can do this.
That's great stuff. I think we have time for one more question. A couple more questions, yeah. Anybody else?
Hello, my name is Mary Urena, and I know we're focusing on local breweries and craft brewers, but we've always had in my lifetime an incredibly large presence by Anheuser-Busch on the north side of town, and now we have BrewDog coming in and making their North American headquarters here in the southeast side of town. And I'm curious what impact you feel that might have on the craft brewing industry here in Central Ohio.
Scott, I think you can answer that as a brewer. How do you feel about that potential competition? I know brewers are notoriously good buddies of each other. So
they pretend. No, you know, Anheuser-Busch, they've notoriously always been behind the curve on trends, and you know, they're just now starting to figure out that there's a craft beer movement, and their answer to it, instead of trying to brew beer like that, is that they're just buying breweries. You know, they bought Goose Island, and you know, so they're just buying up breweries. I mean, I respect them for what they do as far as brewing their beer, but you know, they don't know what's going on. I think that BrewDog, for example, their beer's already here in the market, so it's not like they're going to make a big impact. Now, they are going to open up a brew pub in Franklinton, which I think that's great because, you know, that'll help Franklinton out and it helps Columbus out too. Right now they're hanging their hat on IPAs, and I just, as a lot of people do, and I just think that we'll see how long that lasts, but I don't. IPA is always going to be around, but I don't know if it's going to be as popular as it is now. So I don't know that the larger guys really have much impact on the smaller guys. The smaller guys have to worry about the other smaller guys because it's tough out there. And I don't sell wholesale, so the guys that are here today can give you a better idea of what it's like to keep your product on a shelf and and how it gets knocked off and how you knock off somebody else's product, because it's tough out there now.
I think something that should be added is that most of those guys out there today owe a debt to Scott Francis for not only starting things in Columbus. He is truly the godfather of Columbus brewing. Not only starting something in Columbus, but he taught me how to brew. And his wife, Nana Hronik, also taught me how to brew. But they collectively taught about half of the brewers in this city. Shopped at the winemaker shop, took the hints from Scott, and so, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that little homebrew store has had a lot of impact. That's a separate story.
Andy, do you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Andy Campbell. Thanks for being here, everybody. This is really for Megan, I guess. I'm curious about the history connection, the part about Prohibition as we came out of that and how that affected, I know some of the beers, brands stayed around, but didn't necessarily thrive afterwards. If you could talk a little bit about that period of time.
Yeah, well, during Prohibition, some companies went to near beers, which I think were less than like 2 3/4% beer, or went into manufacturing sodas, other sorts of drinks to maintain their business, which might be the difference between something like the companies that made it out on the other side and maybe like a Hoster, because Prohibition just, killed all sorts of brewing all over the country. And really, you kind of wonder what beer would be like now if we hadn't had Prohibition.
It was 13 years. It was a long time.
Yeah. And, in Ohio, there were places like Westerville where very early in the mid-1800s are already making fermented drinks illegal. So I think that gets to the earlier question about companies combining, and that wasn't just happening in Columbus, it was happening in Cincinnati, it was happening in Cleveland, that some of these breweries are coming together. There's, outside imports coming in from other states and trying to protect their interest. But, you get out on the other side of Prohibition, and, I think before we have the craft beer revitalization, in the 80s and 90s, that we have these more American light beers for the companies that were able to survive. And, so people were still brewing at home. I think in German Village, it was called vinegars. As long as you didn't call it beer, you could still drink it. But it had a huge impact on what we call the brewery district and all the companies that could have been huge powerhouses if it hadn't been for Prohibition, and that if Prohibition hadn't been so strong right in our backyard. And, how many of us live in smaller towns where there was still just recently, dry main streets and, if you forget and try to go buy beer before noon on Sunday, if you're watching a football game, you're out of luck. We're still living with that legacy.
That actually kind of brings up another question. The state law was recently changed to allow higher alcohol content beers. How does that affect the beer, Scott?
I don't think that was pushed so much by brew pub brewers, because 12% beer, you can only drink one if you're driving, and there's no money in selling one beer to a person. The money is in selling 2 beers. So I think the higher alcohol beers tend to be pushed by the wholesalers and the breweries that are packaging the beer so that people can buy them and take them home, and then they can drink them at home. But I've made a 12% beer, but it takes 3 times as long to make, and it takes longer to sell. And you're charging $6 for 8 ounces. So really, for the brew pub guys, I don't think it's a big deal. But for the packaging guys, maybe it is.
Might be added to that the actual law was 6% up until about 10 or 12 years ago, and I do know for a fact that Barley's went up against that particular limit.
Once in a while, a beer would get
then.
out of control.
Yeah, so then it was more of a factor.
The Russian Imperial Stout was. It wasn't that long ago that you couldn't even call something beer if it was over 4.5% alcohol.
Malt liquor.
Malt liquor, and so that's where some of these terms come from.
All right, I think that's it. I think that's all we got for today. Darren Maloney will finish us up here. Thank you.
Yeah.
All three of
Well,
you.
thank you, everybody. That was thoroughly entertaining to walk down a memory lane for many people here in Columbus of the rich history of for the Brewery District. So thank you very much. And you can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide through the Ohio channel and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Please help me to thank our friends representing the Charles Y. and Francis N. Lazarus Legacy Forum. Our partners for today's presentation, the Ohio History Connection and Columbus Landmarks Foundation. And of course, to our knowledgeable speakers, Jay Hoster, Megan Wood, Scott Francis, and Curt Schieber. And thank you to all of you for being here. Have a good afternoon.